Thank you all for coming. And I want to first just say what a tremendous honor it is for me to be here today and to speak with such an illustrious panel. Pono had talked about the relationships and the values and how Aloha connects. And so I just wanted to really start my presentation by saying my connection with the panel, because I think that really exemplifies to me this idea of the value system that we're trying to really communicate to all of you. First I'll just deal with Pono. I mean, if you've heard him speak before, I always learn something new every time I hear from him. And so, when the guy's name is Pono and it's righteousness, I mean, how can he not learn something, right? Colbert, next to me, in his prior life, he was an attorney. He was also the main person that was the special master for the Kamehameha School's Bishop Estate investigation and probate court. And so during that time, I always had a tremendous respect for Colbert. And I'll never forget that when I was first exiting out of law school, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do. So people suggested that I talk to Colbert. I don't know if he remembers this, but he actually took the time to talk with me, even though he wasn't going to hire me. He said, he always is looking to really build up new lawyers and leaders. And so I really, really appreciated him just taking that time for somebody with that kind of reputation to invest that time in someone like a beginning, just out of school lawyer. Robbie, in his many, many other hats, one of which was he was the director for the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs. And he tells this really, really great story, which I don't know if he's going to tell you today, but it's about when he first got in there and he actually went up on the stairs and overlooked the lines that were occurring in the business registration. And he really just kind of observed what it was going on, and he had somebody next to him, and he took the time to actually hear what they suggested in terms of a new way of dealing with it. And it's that kind of perspective that is really, really important anytime you're getting into a new organization. I call it getting up on the balcony, but Robbie really talks about the necessity of that perspective. Finally, Mike, under his previous life and iteration, he was a senator. And so for those of you that don't know, I was in elected office for 11 years. When I first got elected in 2000, I didn't intend to run. I just kind of took a chance, and then I won, and I was all happy and surprised. But one of the first persons that I met was Senator McCartney. He was out of the Senate at that time, and he probably doesn't remember this either. But many, many people are coming up to you, congratulating you, telling you all these kind of things. And Mike actually did this kind of, now that I think about it, a little strange, but it was something very indelible to me. He actually came up to me, stared me in the eye, and touched my heart and said, never forget this, and never forget this is why you ran, and this is where you always need to go to. And so with that, I just wanted to talk about that being the importance of value-based decision-making. Because when it comes to a lot of what you're going to be doing, especially when you're dealing with organizational change and transformational change, you really have to end up boiling it down to values. Because what you have before you sometimes when you have challenges there's two ways of looking at things. There are technical changes and there are adaptive changes. When I talk about technical changes, those are really kind of surface changes. Those are the kind of changes that leadership can just sort of issue a memo on and say, there's a new procedure, there's a new form, you need to do this. And so that comes from the top down. But when you're trying to do organizational transformation, you're really trying to actually transform the organization itself, you need to work from the bottom up. Because the work that is going to be done is not going to be done at the top. The work of the change is going to be done by people at all levels, and especially at the bottom. And so it has to be built up from the bottom upwards. And so when you talk about these adaptive changes, these transformational changes, you have to realize that you're changing attitudes, you're changing values, you're changing behaviors, and you're really, really changing how people define themselves. They have a preconceived notion of what they are and what they do, and you're challenging that. You're telling them you need to do it different. You need to define yourself differently, and you're making people uncomfortable. When you are doing that as a leader, it is really, really hard. It's basically sucks because you are asking people to take on something that they probably don't want to take on. So you have to also realize that the deeper the change, the greater amount of new learning that is going to take place, likely the more resistance you're going to encounter. And through all of that, that means that there's more risks to you as a leader. And so if you are the one leading it, you cannot just approach this in a sort of ad hoc way of thinking, I'm going to issue a memo, I'm going to issue a new manual, and it'll all happen. That is not the way that change is going to happen. Because what you have to also realize at the end of the day is you're asking people to take a leap of faith. You're asking them to have trust in who you are and that you are going to take them to someplace else and that they are going to land safely on their feet and be okay. The only way that they will take that leap of faith is they have to have trust in you. And exactly like Pono had discussed in his slides about the values and that building so that you have relationships and you continue to build and increase relationships, that's what it's going to take. And so ultimately what it takes is this individualism. You need to approach people as people. And that, to me, is one of the core missions and understandings that you need to have when you're trying to undergo a transformational change. And what you need to do, and this is sort of a very theoretical way of approaching it, but what I call controlling the temperature. And so when you talk to individuals about the changes that you need your organization to undertake, sometimes you need to be able to raise the heat, and sometimes you need to be able to lower the heat. And you need to know exactly who you're dealing with and what they will respond to. Because sometimes a certain person, when you challenge them, they will actually react in a way that is positive. Sometimes when you challenge people, they will react in a way that is negative. And you need to understand that because every single person is different. And so that is the challenge that a leader faces anytime you're going to be going through an organizational change. So just very, very briefly, Pono asked me to go through a couple of examples. The first one that I wanted to talk about was civil unions. Whether you're pro or against this issue, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm going to talk about is really the transformational change that had to occur in our organization in order for something like this to pass. Since 2000, basically, there was a civil unions bill. It never went anywhere. In 2009, suddenly we really had some potential momentum. We had a lot of co-signers on the bill. It passed out of the House with 33-17. And then after that, it was like huge protests all over the place. People wearing red shirts. And suddenly, this issue became one of the forefronts and center of our community and discussion. So there was the people that were protesting, there were people that were in favor, they held vigils. And so because of all that public pressure, which rarely happens in the legislative process, what you saw was initially in the Senate, it stalled, but they were able to maneuver and get it out. Then in 2010, they switched it over to the House. And again, there were more protests. They changed from red shirts to white shirts. And then there were all these legislative debates. And let me tell you that in the state capitol, this is the Senate chamber, people are never in the chamber. This is like maybe you're lucky if you've got 2 people. So the fact that it's full is an indication of how much interest there is. And so ultimately what happened was the Senate passed it, then it passed back to the House, and at that time I was the majority leader. So my job was to lead the Democratic caucus, of which I had 34 members. And so that is a time of organizational challenge. When you have a controversial issue, a truly controversial issue that splits the entire caucus in terms of literally people don't want to do it. It's making them uncomfortable. They just wish it would go away. How do you actually do it? I will be honest and say that I failed in the first attempt in January. I tried to see if I could get my members and my colleagues to feel comfortable enough to do it. I talked to all of them. I thought I had maybe the potential votes, but I didn't, and so it failed. Later on, though, as the session wore on, what I continued to do was approach each individual colleague and realize that I needed to understand what their core value was. For some of them, it is a moral conviction. And for them, you know, I can't change that. That is a core moral fiber that they have. And no matter what arguments, no matter what data, no matter what evidence I put in front of them, that's not going to change their mind. There are some that their value was, I need to get reelected. I'm worried that this is going to affect how I get reelected. So what I needed to do was actually show them many, many other states, many, many other ways that this won't affect their reelection. And so I had to work on an individual basis with each member, understand what their concern was, understand what their value was. And in doing so, ultimately I started really understanding my own core values in terms of why I wanted to do this. And this really came to a head on April 29th. And I will tell you that, very, very briefly, I'll tell you a story. This was the last day of the session, and I got a lot of criticism for resurrecting this bill. People thought it was underhanded. But what happened was, this is the last day that I had even a chance to bring it back. And so the night before, I didn't sleep at all. I was tossing and turning because I was torn between, as the majority leader, my loyalty is to my caucus, but as a representative and as a person of why I ran for progressive change, I need to do this. And so I was conflicted within myself in terms of what I'm going to do. But what I found was when I told my colleagues that in a caucus, when I told them why I needed to actually push forward this bill, a lot of them maybe weren't happy with the fact that I needed to do it, but they afforded me that opportunity. They said, you know what, we understand. And so when we talk about our values and our relationships, there really is, to be honest, no better way in which to develop a relationship than when you're sharing your own core values with your colleagues. I know that sounds extremely dangerous. I know it sounds very, very difficult to be vulnerable like that. But if there is a time when you're asking somebody else to understand why you need them to move in a different way, if you express what your core values are, oftentimes that will open the door for them to start understanding you and building that relationship. And so, you know, with civil unions, it continued to move on. The governor vetoed it. But ultimately what this meant was it became another issue for the 2010 election. And then ultimately, the predictions came true. Nobody lost their election because of the vote. And so we ultimately passed that in 2011. So that was sort of the civil union story. The next example that I just want to give very, very briefly is dealing with organizational change in the governor's office. And so as you can see, I left it blank because I didn't plan on having a PowerPoint circulated and all this stuff. And I never know it's going to be videotaped. And so on, right? But let me tell you what happened. So it's been almost a year since I was asked by the governor to become his deputy chief of staff. And it was a very, very difficult decision at the time because I was very comfortable in the legislature. I've been there 11 years. I knew what I was doing. I knew how to get things done. And when the governor asked me to take on this new challenge, I was very, very uncertain and hesitant if I wanted to do it. But ultimately, what drove me to deciding to do it was I looked at our governor's core values. And I am pretty much aligned 100% with his values. And so based off of that, I decided I need to empower him, and the best way to do that is to help him by becoming his deputy chief of staff. So that's why I agreed to do it. So it's such a great thing when you have the same value set as the person that you are following. So my job, actually, is I rarely ever question why he is deciding things. I will only question most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, how he is deciding things and what he is saying in order to justify his decisions. That's where my advice comes in, because I like I said, most of the time, we have the same value set. And so it's so much easier when I understand his values, when I understand what he's trying to achieve, when I understand who he is as a person, then I'm able to help him achieve his goals. And so what I do is I provide advice to say, maybe you need to think about saying it this way. Maybe you need to approach the legislature with this sort of strategy. And maybe we need to have a media strategy that says this message. And so that really is where my advice is giving the governor, I will say I never question his values. I rarely ever have to question his values because I truly believe that we are aligned and step in step. And so that really helps when it comes to dealing with organizational change. I've gone up to the governor's office. It was very difficult being thrown in an environment 1 year into an administration. But I think now that I've been there a year, I think I've kind of grown into the role. And so I understand it a little more. But again, the final message I will leave you with is what I always go back to is I need to spend the time with individuals to understand what their core values are, because that's the only way that I can be effective. I can't do it via a memo. I can't do it via a directive. I have to spend that time with them and understand them. Thank you very much.